Breaking Bad is full of moments where Hank should have caught Walt, from the stolen lab equipment traced back to Walt's own school, to Walt literally telling Hank he has $500,000 in cash and Hank just laughing it off. I'll be going over every reason Hank missed what was right in front of him, starting with the one nobody talks about. So here's the thing most people get wrong about this question. They frame it like Hank made one big mistake somewhere. Like there was a single moment where a smarter detective would have connected the dots and slapped the cuffs on. But that's not what happened at all. What happened is that Hank never even had Walt on the board. Not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, not even as a vague maybe in the back of his mind. And the reason for that has nothing to do with how good Hank was at his job. Because let me be clear about something. Hank Schrader was genuinely excellent at his job. This is the same guy who identified Gus Fring as a drug lord when every other person at the DEA thought he was chasing ghosts. He traced a Los Pollos Hermanos napkin in a dead man's apartment all the way to the owner of a fast food chain, and correctly concluded that the mild-mannered chicken man was running a meth empire. He did this while recovering from a shooting that nearly killed him, working from his bed against the active resistance of his own colleagues. Hank could follow a thread across years of criminal conspiracy and come out right. But none of that mattered when it came to Walt, because the one person Hank would never put at the center of a drug investigation was the quiet, broke, cancer-ridden chemistry teacher who married his wife's sister and needed help paying for treatment. That mental image of Walt was cemented years before Heisenberg ever existed. To Hank, Walter White was the guy who couldn't change a tire without looking like he might pass out. The guy who peaked in his career decades ago ended up teaching unmotivated high school students and then got diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer right around his 50th birthday. Hank teased him at family gatherings. Hank felt sorry for him during chemo. Hank saw Walt as someone who needed protection, not someone who required surveillance. And that identity was so deeply locked in that it didn't just make Hank overlook clues. It made the clues functionally invisible. His brain could not bridge the gap between meth kingpin responsible for dozens of deaths and the man sitting across from him at Thanksgiving dinner looking exhausted from a round of chemotherapy. And if you think that's an exaggeration, there are two moments in the show that prove it beyond any doubt. Season 3, Episode 1. Walt walks into a room carrying a duffel bag and tells Hank, to his face, that it contains $500,000 in cash. Hank doesn't flinch. He doesn't
$500,000 in cash.
Pause. He doesn't even register it as a strange thing to hear. He just laughs, because in his mental universe, there is no scenario, no reality, no timeline where Walter White is sitting on $500,000 of drug money in a bag. Then later, Hank is going through Gail Boetichier's lab notebook and finds a personal dedication to someone with the initials WWW. He jokingly asks Walt if that could stand for Walter White, and Walt, sitting right there, raises his hands with a little smile and says, "You got me." Hank laughs. Again, two completely separate moments where Walt
You got me.
told Hank the truth directly to his face. And both times, Hank's brain rejected the information automatically because the person delivering it didn't match his internal profile of a drug lord. The words went in, and his subconscious deleted them before they could register as meaningful. Now here's the part that makes it genuinely unfair to blame Hank for this. And it also sets up something way worse that happened later. Hank's own boss fell for the exact same psychological trap with a different criminal. George Merkert, the former ace-AC of the Albuquerque DEA office, had Gustavo Fring over for a family cookout, invited him into his home, let Gus meet his family, accepted donations from him, considered him a friend and a valuable community supporter. After Gus was exposed and killed, Merkert stood in the office and admitted that Gus had been operating right under my nose the entire time. And the show makes the irony so obvious, it's almost cruel, because Walt is doing the exact same thing to Hank from an even closer position.
Right under my nose.
If the head of the Albuquerque DEA couldn't see through a drug lord who attended his barbecues, there was never a realistic chance that Hank was going to look at his own dying brother-in-law, a man whose medical bills he was emotionally invested in, and think that's the guy flooding the Southwest with 99% pure methamphetamine. But the blind spot alone doesn't explain everything, because Hank did get real evidence pointing toward Walt's world. Actual, physical, traceable evidence that a strong investigator should follow. The problem is that every single time a clue surfaced, someone else took the fall for it before Hank could trace it all the way back to Walt. And some of those people had absolutely nothing to do with the drug trade. The first one is, honestly, the most infuriating example in the entire series, because Hank was standing in Walt's own classroom when it happened. Season 1. A respirator recovered from a meth cook site in the desert gets traced back to J.P. Wynne High School, the school where Walt teaches chemistry. Hank goes to the school, walks into Walt's lab, and personally inventories the chemistry storage area. He finds that respirators and several pieces of laboratory glassware are missing, equipment that Walt stole to set up his first cook with Jesse. Hugo, the school custodian, gets investigated because he has access to the same storage area, but the search actually clears Hugo of the theft. No stolen chemistry equipment turns up at his place. What they do find is marijuana in his vehicle, which costs him his job and gets him arrested for something completely unrelated to the missing equipment. The theft itself remains officially unsolved, and the real thief was standing beside Hank during the inventory, watching the whole thing happen. And nobody looked twice at him because he was the cancer patient, not the criminal. The investigation just moved on, and the trail never came back to Walt. And after that, the decoys get more intentional. When Badger gets arrested selling blue meth to an undercover officer on a park bench, he gives police a vague physical description of his supplier. Older, bald. That's all they have. So Saul Goodman hires a professional fall guy named Jimmy In-N-Out, a man who has spent most of his life going to prison for other people's crimes, to walk into a controlled buy and get arrested as Heisenberg in front of Hank's surveillance team. During the sting, when the agents have a sightline that could expose the switch, Walt physically positions himself to block their view until the decoy can move into the correct spot. The fake Heisenberg is taken into custody, and the DEA has a face and a name attached to the case. Now Hank is smart enough to notice that blue meth keeps appearing on the street after this arrest, so he doesn't fully buy it. But he doesn't have a better lead, and a publicly arrested Heisenberg temporarily satisfies the institutional pressure to close the investigation. Then, Gail Batisher dies, and everything shifts again. Gail's apartment is a crime scene full of lab equipment, chemistry notes, and a notebook containing detailed formulations that could explain the blue meth's purity. For Hank, Gail looks like the answer to the entire Heisenberg question. A highly trained, eccentric chemist with clear connections to the product. APD Detective Tim Roberts later brings Gail's murder file and lab notebook to Hank at home, hoping it might give Hank something useful to do during his recovery. Hank's investigation of that material is what revives his obsession with the Heisenberg case. For a stretch of Season 4, Hank is genuinely satisfied that the dead man in the apartment was the genius behind it all. And when the investigation eventually pushes past Gail, the trail doesn't lead anywhere near Walt. It lands squarely on Gustavo Fring, who is genuinely operating a massive drug empire complete with a hidden super lab, industrial-scale distribution, cartel ties, and a network of enforcers. And this is the part that makes Hank's situation almost impossible, because he's not wrong about Gus. He presents the DEA with evidence linking Gail to Gus through a Los Polos Hermanos napkin found at Gail's apartment. He finds Gus's fingerprints at the crime scene. He connects the dots between Gus's legitimate businesses and his criminal infrastructure. Every instinct Hank follows during this stretch is completely correct. The investigation is functioning exactly as it should. The problem is that being right about Gus makes it nearly impossible to also be right about Walt, because Gus's empire is large enough, sophisticated enough, and violent enough to explain almost everything Hank has been chasing. The superlab, the blue meth distribution, the cartel violence, the murdered chemist, the money, the enforcers. Gus accounts for all of it. So when Gus is eventually killed and his operation is exposed, the case looks solved. Heisenberg's infrastructure has been identified and dismantled, except Gus was the second to last layer of the operation, not the bottom, and Walt has been standing behind him the entire time, invisible, because every previous suspect absorbed the suspicion before it could reach him. So now you're thinking, okay, the blind spot kept Walt off the radar, and a series of convenient substitutes caught the heat. Bad luck and good decoys. But here's where it gets way worse, because the reason those substitutes worked so well isn't just that they existed in the right place at the right time. It's that Walt had real-time access to the investigation and could steer the next fall guy into Hank's path before Hank could circle back. He wasn't hiding from Hank's case, he was inside it. Literally sitting inside it as Hank's driver, his dinner guest, and the man browsing through Gail's evidence files in Hank's own bedroom. And what he did with that access is the real reason Hank never had a chance. After Hank was injured by the cousins and confined to recovery, Walt became his regular driver. That meant Walt was behind the wheel every time Hank wanted to go somewhere related to the Gus investigation. Walt used those car rides to delay arrivals, call ahead to warn Mike Ehrmantraut about Hank's destination, and relay everything Hank was planning directly to the people Hank was trying to catch. And when Hank one day redirected them toward the industrial laundry that was hiding the superlab underneath it, Walt realized he had no other option, and deliberately drove into oncoming traffic. He crashed the car, injuring himself and his own brother-in-law, because letting Hank walk through that door would have exposed everything. When Gomez later did get inside the laundry with authorization, the lab was hidden well enough that he left with nothing. But Walt had been willing to cause a car accident involving a family member to make sure that visit never happened with Hank in it. And that's still not the worst of it. When Hank casually asked Walt about Jesse's RV in conversation, Walt didn't sit around hoping it would blow over. He immediately called Saul and then raced to the junkyard to have the RV destroyed. Badger saw what was happening and warned Jesse, and Jesse rushed to the lot to try to stop it. The problem is that Hank had been tailing Jesse, so Jesse unknowingly led Hank directly to the RV he'd been searching for. But Old Joe, the junkyard owner, challenged Hank's legal authority to search the vehicle without a warrant. While Hank was stuck arguing outside, Walt and Jesse were trapped inside the RV. Walt called Saul and had his receptionist Francesca call Hank's cell phone directly, posing as an Albuquerque police officer and falsely reporting that Marie had been in a serious accident. Hank panicked, abandoned the RV, and drove to the hospital at full speed. By the time he discovered the call was a lie, the RV had been crushed into scrap metal. That deception worked because the caller knew Marie's full name, knew she was Hank's wife, and understood exactly which emotional pressure point would override a trained agent's judgment in the middle of an active evidence pursuit. Walt's team turned Hank's love for his wife into a weapon against his investigation, and they destroyed the single most important physical link between Walt and the meth operation in the process. And what makes this even more painful is that this wasn't even the first time Hank's intelligence was being manipulated. Better Call Saul reveals that years before Walt ever cooked a batch, the information flowing to Hank's DEA office was already being shaped by criminals. Lalo Salamanca had Saul negotiate an arrangement where Crazy 8, a dealer in the Salamanca network, fed Hank the locations of Gus Fring's dead drops as a confidential informant. The purpose wasn't to help the DEA. It was to weaponize the DEA against a rival organization. Hank ran the operation, got arrests, and $700,000 in seized cash, and was still dissatisfied because the senior figures were free. His instincts were sharp. His information pipeline was compromised. He was making correct deductions from manipulated data, which is the hardest kind of deception to catch, because the results look like success. By the time Walt enters the picture, Hank has already been operating in an environment where the criminals around him understand exactly how to feed him just enough truth to keep him pointed in the wrong direction. But here's the thing that makes all of this feel almost inevitable, rather than just unlucky. Walt didn't pull this off alone. He had an entire professional infrastructure working alongside him, and each person in that machine covered a different category of vulnerability that Hank would normally exploit to build a case. Saul Goodman handled legal cover, decoys, and criminal contacts. He created the Jimmy in-and-out fake arrest. He executed the Marie phone call that Walt devised from inside the RV. He connected Walt to every criminal contact and professional service the operation needed to survive. And in Better Call Saul's series finale, Jimmy McGill stood up in a federal courtroom and admitted that he kept Walt out of jail, laundered his money, lied, and conspired for him, and that Walt could not have built the empire without his help. He said Hank and Gomez would still be alive if he hadn't made the choices he made. That's not a fan theory or a reading between the lines. That's the character's own confession under oath. Mike Ehrmantraut ran the intelligence and security side, using listening devices that Walt had secretly planted in Hank's office during a staged emotional breakdown. Mike monitored the feed and used it to track active search warrants and stay ahead of every move law enforcement made. His background as a former police officer meant he understood precisely what evidence Hank needed to build a prosecutable case, and he helped dismantle each piece before Hank could assemble it. Walt later went back and removed the bugs himself. And then Walt killed Mike, eliminating a senior insider who knew enough about the operation to bury everyone involved if he ever decided to cooperate. And then there's Skylar. She built the gambling addiction cover story that explained Walt's sudden, unexplainable cash to anyone who asked questions. And when Saul recommended a laser tag business as a money laundering front, Skylar rejected it, chose the A1A car wash instead, engineered the entire acquisition strategy, and ran the operation that converted drug revenue into legitimate business income. And when Hank confronted her directly after discovering the truth about Walt, she pointed out that he had nothing definitive and made the calculated decision to stay silent. She understood something critical about Hank's position. His entire case rested on a book inscription and family suspicion, not on courtroom-grade evidence. And as long as nobody in the family confirmed what Hank already knew, it stayed that way. On top of all of that, Walt had Jack Welker's prison contacts murder 10 men who could have cooperated with federal prosecutors before the DEA could secure their testimony. He destroyed Gus's encrypted surveillance laptop by hauling a massive magnet to the police evidence room and frying the hard drive through the wall before anyone could examine its contents. Every category of proof that Hank might have used to build a case, whether it was cooperative witnesses, electronic records, financial documentation, or physical evidence, was being actively located and destroyed by people who understood exactly what law enforcement needed and how to take it away. With all of that stacked against him, Walt should have gotten away with it permanently. And for a while, he did. After months of expanding the meth empire to its peak, Skylar showed Walt the enormous pile of cash he had accumulated, and he finally told her he was out. He retired. And by that point, the investigation had lost nearly every usable witness and lead.
I'm out.
The DEA had exposed Gus's infrastructure, but there was no evidence tying Walter White to any of it. Walt was free, and he would have stayed free for the rest of his life if he could have controlled one thing he never learned how to manage: his ego. Because the thing that finally exposed Walter White wasn't a witness or a wiretap or a forensic breakthrough. It was a poetry book he refused to throw away because it was the only physical object on Earth that proved someone once recognized his genius. Season 4, Episode 5. Hank is at dinner, satisfied with his conclusion that Gail Bödischer was the Heisenberg they'd been looking for all along. The investigation is effectively over in his mind. Then Walt, a few drinks in, starts arguing that Gail's lab work looked like it was copied from someone better, and that the real chemist might still be out there. He physically could not sit at that table and let a dead man receive credit for his chemistry. That single drunken comment at a family dinner reopened the entire Heisenberg investigation and pointed Hank
Maybe he's still out there.
down the path from Gail to Gus Fring that consumed all of Season 4. Walt talked Hank out of closing the case because his pride wouldn't allow anyone, living or dead, to be called the genius behind the blue meth. And then there's the book itself. Gail had given Walt a personal copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass with a handwritten inscription. To my other favorite WW, followed by Gail's initials, GB Walt kept it. That's the part that matters. He kept it. A man who destroyed laptops, murdered witnesses, burned down laboratories, and orchestrated the systematic elimination of every person who could connect him to the drug trade, decided that this one object, a book inscribed by a man he'd murdered, was worth holding on to. That book sat in his bathroom under a pile of magazines, like a trophy he couldn't bring himself to discard. Because that's exactly what it was. It wasn't a book to Walt. It was proof that a fellow scientist, someone who understood chemistry at a level most people never reach, had looked at Walt's work and recognized greatness. Walt could throw away the money. He could walk away from the empire. But he couldn't throw away the one physical object that acknowledged who he really was, because his entire life before Heisenberg had been defined by not receiving that acknowledgement. Hank found it while using the White's bathroom. He opened it, saw the handwriting, recognized it from Gail's lab notebook, and in that single moment, the entire case restructured itself in his head. He went home, compared the inscription to years of accumulated evidence, and reconstructed every connection. Walt to Jesse, Walt to Gail, Walt to Gus, Walt to every unexplained coincidence and suspicious event across the entire investigation. Years of cover stories, false suspects, destroyed evidence, and professional misdirection all collapsed because Walt kept a sentimental gift from a murdered colleague sitting next to his toilet like it was a bathroom reader. But here's what a lot of people don't process about what happened after Hank figured it out. Knowing the truth and proving the truth turned out to be completely different problems. And this gap is where most viewers lose track of how trapped Hank actually was. Skylar wouldn't talk. The physical evidence was destroyed or buried. The witnesses who could have corroborated anything were dead. And Walt still had one weapon left: a fabricated confession video that rearranged real events to make Hank look like the criminal mastermind who coerced Walt into cooking meth against his will. The genius of that fake confession is that every element in it was constructed from things that genuinely happened, just reframed. The ride-along that started everything? In the real story, Hank invited Walt as a birthday treat, and Walt used it to find Jesse. In the fake version, Hank recruited Walt shortly after his 50th birthday and then used the ride-along to show him how profitable the meth business could be. The Salamanca Cousins parking lot attack that nearly killed Hank? In Walt's version, Gus arranged that hit as retaliation against Hank. Walt even claimed that Hank later forced him to build the bomb that killed Gus. And then, there's the $177,000 of Walt's drug money that Marie had unknowingly accepted to pay for Hank's physical therapy after the cousins shot him. That money was real. Marie really did accept it, and that financial trail alone was enough to make the fake confession look credible to anyone who hadn't lived through the real events. After watching the tape, Hank told Marie that revealing Heisenberg was his own brother-in-law would end his career immediately. He'd been sassy while his brother-in-law was the biggest meth manufacturer in the Southwest. Even if he could prove it, his judgment and credibility were permanently compromised. The money made it worse. The medical bills created a paper trail that Walt's fabricated story could point to as evidence of a payoff. Hank was stuck in a position where going public with the truth would look almost exactly like the lie Walt had constructed to destroy him. Hank only broke through when he went completely off the books. He couldn't go to the DEA. He couldn't use official channels. He couldn't even file paperwork without exposing himself. So he recruited Jesse Pinkman, the one living person willing to describe Walt's operation from the inside. Jesse was the witness Hank never thought he'd need, because Jesse had been on the other side of Hank's investigation for years. The kid Hank had once beaten so badly he was hospitalized. Now they were allies, because both of them had finally understood what Walt really was. Hank brought Gomez in as his only trusted professional partner, and even Gomez needed to see Jesse's recorded confession before he was willing to believe that Hank's brother-in-law was Heisenberg. Together, they deceived Huel Babineau into revealing the rental van and 7 barrels that were used to transport Walt's cash, then fabricated a photograph of what appeared to be a freshly unearthed money barrel. They texted the photo to Walt. He panicked, raced to the actual burial site in the desert, and screamed self-incriminating details over the phone while Hank tracked the call. Hank followed him to Tohajili, the exact same stretch of desert where Walt and Jesse cooked their very first batch together, and arrested him in handcuffs. After everything, the blind spot, the substitute suspects, the inside sabotage, the professional machine, and Walt's own ego, Hank finally had him. And then Jack Welker's gang pulled up with automatic weapons. Gomez was shot and killed. Walt offered every dollar he had to spare Hank's life. And Hank, identifying himself as ASAC Schrader to the end,
"My name is ASAC Schrader. You can go fuck yourself,"
told Walt that Jack had made his decision 10 minutes ago and refused to beg. Jack shot him in the forehead. The one time Hank beat everything the system threw at him, the system Walt built killed him before the arrest ever reached a courthouse or a courtroom. Subscribe if you want more Breaking Bad content.